Well, it's another day on the home front and another project I've been wanting to get to for quite a while. I've got a tractor behind me and I've got a plate of steel and I got some cardboard. So what could we be working on today? Well, anybody that's ever bought a tractor knows that you're supposed to get the backhoe and you're supposed to get it when you purchase it. Because if you try to add it on later, it's excessively expensive. And that's what I did. I forgot to get the backhoe. I didn't think I was going to need one. And to be honest, I don't need it for much. Just every now and then it would be really cool if I had a backhoe. Now, I almost purchased one a couple months ago for $5,500. And that's actually about the best price I've been able to find. But there's another gimmick. Everybody talks about using a stump bucket. Well, I have used the forks quite a lot. And once or twice I probably used it even like a stump bucket would be used. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to build a stump bucket today. Well, not today. It's probably going to take me many days. But if you want to, watch me try and let's see how this turns out. Well, here is that stump bucket and it's about 90% complete and it's turning out just fine. Well, this video might be a little bit long, but you'll have to make it to the end to see how it turns out. And I am Ben and this is the DIY Homefront channel. Thanks for watching. Now I've got a sheet of metal and to be honest, it's not all that thick. And the reason why I'm planning on using that thinner metal is because I've got a smaller tractor. Now if I had a 3 or a 4 series, I'd want the beefiest stump bucket I could find. But if I'm bending that stump bucket with this tractor, then I'm probably doing something I shouldn't be anyway. Now I've got two choices. I can either build something that will mount onto my fork platform, or I could build a separate attachment. I've got the hooks that are meant to go on the front, but you can see that's awful big, isn't it? I'm going to be using quite a bit of metal to make a quick disconnect. So I'm sort of stuck in a planning phase, and which way do I go from here? Well, it's one thing to watch a couple of videos or to have an idea in your head of what something's going to be like, but it's very difficult to go from it's in my head to in front of me without doing some preliminary work. And for me, that means designing it. And I don't have any computer software or a CNC machine to help me with this. So I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way with some cardboard and some tape. And I'm basically going to build my stump bucket to proportions so that way I can get an idea of exactly what it's going to look like. And I'll do that before we get the plasma cutter out and the welder and do anything in metal or anything that's going to be permanent. Well, I probably spent a good hour on this mock-up designing how this stump bucket was going to be. And during that process, I went from having a stump bucket that would be a quick attach to a stump bucket that I was going to bolt onto my pallet forks. And that's one advantage of actually making something and having it in front of you. And that's why I like to do this, because I end up changing my design for the better, I think, than from what I originally started with in my head. Well, for this project, I purchased a 4 by 6 foot piece of 1/4 inch plate metal. And I purchased a new plasma cutter that can also stick and TIG weld for this too. After I finish a couple of projects, I'll do a review on the plasma cutter. But for now, let's focus in on this plate. I'll start by cutting out the 4 major pieces for this stump bucket. The back mounting plate, the 2 sides, and the bottom of the stump bucket. Something else, since I had never used a plasma cutter, there was a little bit of a learning curve that I had to get over. Just some helpful pointers for somebody that's just starting out. Make sure that the metal you're cutting has a clean, smooth surface, so that way you have a good contact between the plasma cutter and that metal that you're trying to cut through. I made a fire pit with the leftover material I had because I changed the design of this stump bucket. And I got a lot better with the plasma cutter and a lot better with the stick welder. So I wouldn't say if you're watching this and you see the way I cut or weld to assume that I am a pro or an expert. I welcome any suggestions or comments that you viewers have that might improve my skills. Well, with that piece cut, I can go ahead and lay my cardboard template on top of it and mark that piece of metal and do the prep work before I go ahead and plasma cut this next section off. And I will continue to do this until I've got all the pieces I'm going to need to weld this stump bucket up. But once I had a few of the metal pieces cut, I went back to my template And in red, I marked all the bolt locations where this will actually be attached to that pallet fork frame. And I want to make sure I get all this stuff located so you don't end up having a piece of metal or a weld someplace where you don't want it. So we got the back and the two sides, and I tried to be artistic or fancy and make a jagged edge. I'm really hoping that they'll act like the teeth that are on a saw, and if I end up getting any roots, that those might help rip or cut the roots apart. Well, it's always a little rough the first time you do stuff. It's not like I'm going to come out of the gate with a plasma cutter and be a professional and have the best cuts and everything be perfect. I'm sort of going to have to earn that through time and effort. But I'm hoping that we will get there. I'm hoping. Well, after looking at the sides for a while, I decided a bunch of small teeth would do better than large teeth. So I used the plasma cutter and went back and made the teeth a lot smaller. But the stump bucket itself really isn't that complex. You've got the back plate, the two sides, and a bottom, and that's pretty much it. The more I used the welder, the more I realized how important it was to have clean surfaces when you're trying to weld metal. So I spent a lot more time cleaning things up before I finished welding things together. I started by tacking things together and then used my flux core welder to finish up a lot of the welds, moving around so that way there wasn't too much heat in any one area. And since I'm new to welding and I'm not that good, I spent a lot of time with the grinder going back cleaning everything up. It took quite a few hours of welding before I had both sides of all these pieces welded together. I marked the location where I would put the mounting bolts on the back of this bracket. Then I added a couple of support brackets to strengthen everything up. That included me putting 2 support brackets on the bottom of the bucket to keep any of this metal from tearing. So now that we've got the stump bucket pretty much welded up, it's time to figure out how we're going to mount this to the pallet forks. And I'm going to use 4 carriage bolts, and I'm going to use the notches that are already built into these pallet forks as a place to put those carriage bolts. Now that I've got it marked, I'll need to drill a hole for the carriage bolts. This actually was a little bit harder than I was expecting. After using a punch to make a mark, I ended up using several different drill bits until I finally got the hole big enough that I could use one of those step bits. The plate metal was big enough that even though I was using a step bit, I had to go from both sides before I could finally get the hole big enough, because these are 3/4 inch carriage bolts that I'm using. Now I repeated this process 3 more times until I had 4 holes for the 4 carriage bolts. So eventually I'll have 4 of those bolts to hold the top portion on. And then I spent quite a bit of time making these pieces. And this will go right here and be welded to help hold it in place, and there'll be 4 per side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and tack these pieces on while the stump bucket's on the pallet forks, and then I can take it off and weld everything up. Now I know these welds are pretty ugly, and that's one reason why I chose to put 4 of those support brackets on each side. I figured I would need to do that because I couldn't totally trust all of my welds. And in the end, it should really make it pretty easy when I want to put the stump bucket onto the tractor. All I need to do is go up with my pallet forks and put them on the bottom, and then tighten the bolts from the top. Well, I wasn't really happy with my wire welding, so I ended up getting some sticks to stick weld, and I watched a bunch of videos, and I think the only thing I can say for sure is at the moment I don't have the gift for welding, not yet. I'll keep trying, but it's very discouraging. Well, I ended up buying a Piranha tooth bar for my front end loader that goes on this John Deere tractor, and it really helps dig. So the last thing I'm going to do for this stump bucket is I'm going to build some teeth that I can bolt onto the end to help dig into the ground and rip through stuff. So making it out of cardboard allowed me to see what it looked like and make some changes to it, giving me some really aggressive teeth on the end. So I left all the shots in of me using the plasma cutter to cut this tooth bar because I really feel like I have improved since I started using it. Making sure your surface is really clean helps a lot. And you can see I'm even starting and stopping in the middle of this piece of metal without any problems at all. I'll end up cutting another piece of metal that's got this same tooth pattern, so that way I can double up the thickness to make sure that I don't end up bending the teeth. There's also a fair amount of cleanup you have to do on the back side of these pieces of metal once you use a plasma cutter, because there'll be some leftover blown metal that ends up attaching to it. Well, I spent quite a bit of time on this, getting it really nice and pretty, and it was going to go right here. And then I was going to put another plate on top of it. And I was worried that it was going to bend right there, one way or the other. And I thought, wow, I should just make it 2 layers thick. So that's what I did. I ended up making one and then another one. And I will weld these 2 pieces together. And I was still worried about it bending right where it meets the rest of the stump bucket, so I decided I would put a couple of extra fingers on it, and that would keep that piece from bending and give it some more strength. So the only thing left to do is weld all this up now that you can see what my ideas are. Well, with the tooth bar completely welded up, I could determine where I was going to put the bolts that would hold it on, and ended up drilling through the tooth bar and leaving marks on the stump bucket so I knew where all my holes were and everything was lined up. Well, I slowly enlarged the holes until they were the right diameter for the bolts. And with the holes the right size, I went ahead and attached the tooth bar with the bolts. This was just a test fit, so I didn't tighten them up. Boy, I'm so happy to have the mineral spirits out. That means I'm going to clean things up and it's time to get a coat of paint on it. I'll wipe all the surfaces down really well with the mineral spirits to make sure I have a clean surface for the paint to stick to. I'll be putting a rattle can paint job on this, and I'm going to use my favorite paint, the Rust-Oleum Gloss Black Enamel Oil-Based Paint. Well, if you're going to put multiple coats of paint on, you have to wait about 20 minutes before you can put the next coat on, which gives me plenty of time to clean up the stump bucket and wipe it down with mineral spirits. Now that it's cleaned up, it's time to start the process of putting multiple coats of paint on the stump bucket. In the end, I ended up with 2 good coats of paint on all the surfaces. Well, it's been about 2 weeks since I was working on this stump bucket, but I finally got it all finished up, and let's see what it's going to take to attach the stump bucket to the front of my tractor. I'll have to remove the pallet forks off of the pallet fork frame, obviously. And these pallet forks are smaller than other John Deere tractors like the 3 and 4 series, so they're not as heavy and not as bad to remove. Next, I started up the tractor and approached the stump bucket, trying to center up the pallet forks with the stump bucket. And then I just pushed the pallet fork down onto the bottom of the stump bucket, lining up the bolt holes the best I could. Here you can see the bolt holes. And then all I had to do is just push the carriage bolts through the back plate and put the nut and washers on the front side. Well, obviously this is not as fast as doing a quick attach, but I think it's going to really work well. It took a lot less materials, and with my skill level, it wasn't as difficult. And to be honest, most of the time when I put an attachment on the tractor, I use it for a pretty good bit of time. Very, very rarely have I ever been switching through attachments when I'm doing a project. So I don't think it's going to be that bad to spend 3 or 4 minutes to get this done every time I need to use the stump bucket. Well, the final step was just to go back with a nice ratchet wrench and get all of these nuts tightened up. and that included the 2 bolts that held the tooth bar in place. Well, thanks for watching the DIY channel. Here on the home front, I videotape everything I do. I don't know what's important and what's not, so I just videotape it all. But you can see, you can about do anything if you try. So like, subscribe, check out my other videos, and I'll see you in the next one.